Welcome back to Martins and More. My name's Maury Rutch.
And I'm Spoon Phillips.
And we have a lot to talk about today. What's going on, Spoon?
Well, it's actually a very nice day, I'd say, at least here in Brooklyn. I hope to maybe get out and see a little bit of it. It's still, late winter chill, but could be a lot worse. And I'm looking very forward to today's show, as a matter of fact. We had a listener bring up a topic for a possible show that speaks to the heart of myself and Maury. So thanks very much for that suggestion, because today's topic is the OM.
Oh, I misunderstood. I thought it was
No, it is the orchestra model. The only problem with that is, what does that mean? It actually means different things to different people. So, but a lot of people know that right now Martin offers models called OMs, which stands for Orchestra Model. And this is a guitar that's got a body that's smaller than a dreadnought or a jumbo or a grand performance. It's one of their traditional body shapes. It has the exact same body as a triple O or triple aught or triple knot, and but they have some differences. The OMs, of course, have a long scale neck. Nowadays, most triple O's have a short scale neck, and in the old days, that was a major demarcation between an OM and a triple O. Back before the Reimagined Standard series appeared in 2018, OMs also had a wider fingerboard and wider string spacing than triple O's. Today, they both use the high performance taper with 1 3/4 inch width nut, where it used to only be OMs that had a 1 3/4 inch width nut. And they both have a 2 1/8 inch width at the 12th fret, when the orchestra models used to have 2 1/4 wider spacing, wider string spacing. And now today they both have the 2 5/32 of an inch string spacing. So the OM and the triple O's have gotten closer together. All OMs have 1/4 inch bracing, scalloped, and the long scale neck. Most triple O's have a short scale neck, and most triple O's have 5/16 inch bracing, but the triple O 18 has 1/4 inch bracing. So the OMs are more consistent in that sense. So, Maury, why don't you just take us through what OMs are available that come off the top of your head for sale now at Maury's Music?
Well, I'll be happy to, and that dives right into the reasoning that you just spoke of. Depending on who you ask and how you ask it, we can say that there are a certain number of OMs in the catalog that are specifically titled OM, and there are also some guitars in Martin's current catalog in 2023 that by all rights, they are OMs because they have a 1 3/4 inch nut, and they also have a long scale length, but Martin still calls them triple O. So to keep things sort of easy to understand, I'll answer your question more deliberately, and I will let you know that the Martins that are currently available as an OM are things like the OM28, the OM21, OM42, and then some nice variations of the OM28. You can get it with a pickup system. The OM28E comes with either LR bags or Fishman electronics, or you can graduate to the OM28E Modern Deluxe. And I jumped over them a little bit accidentally. The OM28 is also available in a Modern Deluxe without the electronics. Other popular guitars that are still in the current production, the OMC X1E Black, OME Cherry, and the OMJM. They're going to round out what you can basically buy from Martin Guitar at any authorized dealer in the year 2023. There are some more custom options that we like to order in. We can certainly let you know about them as the show progresses. But you do have a pretty healthy choice when it comes down to which OM would you like. And that's not even counting those triple O guitars that Martin calls triple O's that kind of really are OMs anyway.
That's true. And there's a lot of reasons these overlap and at times can be confusing. And you really have to go back to the very beginning and the history of that, which I'm going to get to in a little bit. But I want to put in my own thinking cap to see if I can remember any other OMs that might be out there still. And I can think of one that wasn't mentioned that is an artist's signature model. And Les Maury mentioned it really quickly. So, So that can be part of our trivia question. We're going to have 2 trivia questions today then. One of them is, what Martin OM is for sale today that is an artist's signature model edition? And I look forward to reading the comments on the YouTube version of this podcast to see who might have gotten that. And then I'll ask the other trivia question a little bit later. So it's interesting when you go through this, what immediately pokes out to me from this is you mentioned all these OM28s and the OM42, and nowhere did I hear the word 18 anywhere. And that always makes me very sad that they don't make an OM18 with mahogany back and side. But they have here and there, and they probably will again. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see a OM18 Modern Deluxe fairly soon either. So yes, so the OMs are considered extremely versatile. They have a long scale neck with a auditorium size body. That's what they call that technically, that's used for the OM and the triple O. And it has the same depth of the double O, but a wider top, a little larger sound hole, a little bit longer top. And when you mix a long scale string tension on that size top with scalloped 1/4-inch bracing, that makes a very reverberative top, and it vibrates easier. And you put all that long scale tension into it, the energy that it produces gives you a very big voice with a good bass response. It's considered one of the most even sounding, so that the mid-range and the bass and the treble are basically on the same plane. So fingerstyle players are often drawn to it. But you can basically do anything on an OM that you can do in a dreadnought, which Maury Rutch proves over and over again when he plays his well-worn OM28V from the vintage series. And today's modern OM28 is virtually identical. It just doesn't have the wider V neck. As I mentioned, it's got the modern high-performance neck. But would you say that's a pretty big seller?
Oh, yeah, I certainly would. Not just at Martin, but here at Maury's Music. The OM28 really, really is one of the best sellers, and for good reason. And we get a lot of calls and emails all week long asking for expert advice. And most of those customers who come to tell me they want to buy a standard series Martin and they do a healthy mixture of fingerstyle and heavy strumming, the OM28 has to get recommended. And it's just because I know that's what it does. That's why I chose the OM28 as my own. And like you were saying a moment ago, it's just one of those things, the extra string tension. Whenever I think of designing a Martin guitar or how they build Martin guitars, when you want to achieve either a bass boost, a treble boost, balanced voice, the two things that really come into play are the depth of the guitar and the size of the guitar. So a very small double O that's got a top that's not very wide and it's a very shallow depth, that's going to give you one sound. When you go to another extreme, a dreadnought with a very deep depth from top to back and a big wide top, that's the other extreme. And you can basically play with those ingredients to get a sound that you're looking for. And the OM, by no accident, just really arrives near the middle. So you're not overly bass heavy, you're not lacking bass, you're not quiet, you're not as loud as the dreadnought. It's the medium of Martin guitars, as far as I can tell. And a lot of players that call us up that take the time to ask for advice, there aren't that many people that this wouldn't really suit well. It's not fair to say it's the right guitar for everybody, but if there was one right guitar size for almost everybody, I'll say that it's the OM.
From my very first understanding of Martin guitars, and I came to that relatively late when I was a teenager and well into my 20s, I didn't pay attention to what brand of guitars famous people played and all that. I just knew what I liked the sound of. Turned out it was the Martin sound that people like Neil Young were getting and out of their acoustic guitars. But when I first started looking into Martins and was in New York City after the university and started going to guitar stores, guitar magazines like Acoustic Guitar would have advertising for Eric Schoenberg's shop in Massachusetts, and eventually moved out to California. He actually started in Pittsburgh, and his Schoenberg soloists, which were a joint venture with Martin, where he was a big lover of the 1930s OMs and had gotten Martin to make OMs that had much more vintage appeal to them in terms of the specs and the bracing and the particularly the big V-necks, and but he had cutaways with them too, which is not traditional. And they cost a lot of money, and I would see them in magazines, and I always wanted to have one. And the first ones were basically made by Dana Bourgeois and his assistant T.J. Thompson, that with Martin materials, and then they would ship them to Martin for construction. And then after that, after Dana pulled out, T.J. took over as the main builder. And as far as you know, T.J. did all of the pyramid bridges and all those, most of the vintagey stuff for Dana anyway, and the neck joints and all that. And then after TJ went away, Eric Schoenberg got a variety of builders to make these. And I think after TJ Thompson, that was the last involvement Martin had with it. And then he went off and just kept making them with small builders. But that got me turned on to the idea of the OM. And then I would start going to Mandolin Brothers, which was that store in Staten Island that was basically a hands-on guitar museum. And this was back before vintage Martins were showing up in guitar stores, because their prices hadn't really skyrocketed yet. So I had yet to see a vintage OM. But Larry Wexer, who is now a private dealer, like private vintage guitar hunter-downer for people who can afford that sort of thing, he had written an article about, would you rather have an OM, if you could go back in time to the 30s, would you rather have an OM or a triple O? And that then got me even more interested. So so I ended up buying the very first OM18V that came out of Martin. And but prior to that, I had a Bourgeois mahogany OM, and I had a Collings mahogany OM because Martin wasn't making them. And then after that, I ended up getting a used OM28 VR, and the rest was history. And I had a deep body OM signature model from Pat Donahue, who was the guitar player. He was a national champion finger stylist, but he also was the guitar player on the Prairie Home Companion for years and years and years, and things of that nature. So I was always OM. But as I got older, a lot of people know I converted to the short scale, and I so now don't play OMs, but I still love them, and I still think they have superior tone. I also have owned a couple of the Juber models, and I think, like you said, it's the most versatile, between the two of us, we've said it's the most versatile, and kind of in the center of all that Martin-ness is the OM. And I think they sound different than M's, which have a wider top. I think the M's give you more of a triple O sound, which I hear as being gathered and punchy and really forward shooting, where the OMs, to my head, sound more expansive and more like expand in all directions and give a much more rounder, bigger, wider projection. So big fan of the OMs, and I'm surprised there isn't one right now in the 16 series, because there have been various OM16s in the past. So I won't be surprised if we don't see one of those. And tell me about those OM Modern Deluxes and the Authentic Series OM28 1931. Did you sell many of those?
We sold our fair share of the OM28 Authentics. We didn't really do as well with them as we've begun to do now with the Modern Deluxe. And, no doubt because of the price point, it definitely took some people out of the running when it came to what they wanted to buy. When we had an opportunity to give people choices back when the 28 Authentics were popular, the people that did get an opportunity to play them were almost always singing in their praises. But you have to remember, the Authentics, there are some things about that model that aren't as kind as far as playability or adjustability. When you get an authentic guitar, you might love the sound and not like the neck. You might love the action and the setup, but you can't make adjustments as easily because the saddles are glued in. The truss rods are either missing, or they might be T-bars, or they might be in there as a truss rod but not adjustable. So making a commitment to an authentic isn't always about just the price, but you have to definitely make sure that you like a guitar that you can't set up as quickly yourself or make adjustments on the fly as much as I can turn the truss rod on my OM28V, or change the saddle anytime I want. Those things really can't be done on an authentic without some real work. It doesn't mean you shouldn't look at them, but it's something you should definitely bear in mind when you're in the market. So to answer your question, we didn't sell as many of them as we would things like the OM28 or even the OM28Es, but I have to suspect a lot of people that could afford either one either got scared away from some of those authentic features, or maybe for other reasons, they just went with a different guitar. I think, if I'm remembering right, most people who came in our store years ago looking at the authentics bought some sort of an OM if they didn't choose the authentic. So it wasn't very often that somebody pushed the authentic away and got a dread or got a double O. I think, if I'm remembering as hazy as my memory can be, people that made their mind up to go in that direction probably settled is the wrong word, but those that refused to go with the authentic probably went with something a little bit similar but same size. But I'll tell you what, when I say that, some of my best memories of Martin Fests in the past are centered around someone's OM28 authentic, because that guitar, there are some really, really good sounding instruments at Martin Fest, and that guitar is always at the front of my mind.
That's a shout out to Stan the Man down in Jacksonville, Florida, who doesn't bring it every year, but we've been very fortunate that he's brought it more than one year. And so we actually get to see that guitar grow up. And it is proof positive that even though those torrefied tops have officially stopped aging because they've blasted them with such high heat, it's crystallized the interior. So that it's, basically already a 90-year-old piece of wood. All the glue joinery and other aspects of that guitar definitely advance in terms of tone production as the years go by. Yeah, the OM28 Authentic 1931 has a V-neck, and ironically, it was taken from Mike Seeger's 1931 OM28. It actually has a pointier V than a lot of OMs from 1931 and 1930, which are notoriously comfortable as vintage V-necks go. And so it's interesting. They always take a guitar that is in 100% all original condition to make an authentic, and Seeger's OM was. So they used that, and I just thought it was interesting that because I played that actual guitar and of course the authentic prototypes and stuff, and it's not the most comfortable 1931 OM neck I've ever played, but whereas these modern deluxes have the vintage deluxe neck profile, and that was actually copied from a vintage OM, the 1930 OM45 Deluxe that's owned by the Martin Museum, which may have the most comfortable vintage neck I've ever played. I absolutely love the neck on that guitar, and it's a asymmetrical neck. So there's a little more meat on the bass side of the V than the treble side. It's like a faster roll off on the treble side. And not only that, the V point of the V, the apex of it, doesn't just run straight down the neck like it does on modern guitars and modern V-necks. It actually drifts. So as your hand turns, if you just picture your hand playing, let's say a open C chord down at the nut, and you slide that up the strings, and your elbow tips in and starts pointing down to the floor, and your wrist turns. So you have a very different grip by the time you get up to the 7th fret and on up to the neck, all up to the heel. And that V drifts so it stays in the nook of your palm. And it's really very super comfortable. And that then inspired them to come up with the helical neck they use on those new fancy CS models, SC models rather. And but anyway, the modern deluxe, the major difference between the modern deluxe neck and that actual old OM is they have a modern heel. So it doesn't get as thick as you come up into the upper frets as an actual vintage Martin. So super comfortable all the way up and super sleek, almost electric guitar sleek when you get up in, as far as you can make that F shape, that first position F shape all the way up the neck, you still get a nice sleek neck. And so it's really my favorite neck shape today. Major difference in the OM28. Here's kind of a trivia question. There's a major difference in the OM28 Modern Deluxe than the other Modern Deluxes, and that is it still has what they call the standard fretboard taper. So it's 2 1/4 at the 12th fret. So it's got the feeling much more like a pre-war OM than any of the other models in the Modern Deluxe, because it's got the wider fretboard, which a lot of fingerstyle players are very happy about. And I know our pal Lawrence Juber, who for years played modified V-necks on his signature models, his private custom that they made for him recently actually now has the Modern Deluxe OM neck shape on it because of his own, as he's just like me, you get older and your hands start to get creaky, and so he's got some arthritis issues, so he now has the Modern Deluxe neck on his most recent private OMC. So very cool guitars, and they do link back to the 1930s. And so you started in 06, I believe. So your shop's opened in 06 at the grand opening?
Nope, 03.
03. I always get that wrong. I'm so sorry. So 03, okay, so 2003. But you already had your OM28V. When did you get that?
Oh, I got the OM28V back in 1998.
And it came to you as a gift, as I recall.
It certainly did. I got my money's worth out of that thing.
And the gift giver has gotten a lot of money worth out of that rolling pin that she has to wave at you now and again. Yeah, so that was a present from your... Were you married at the time?
Yes, that was a gift from Santa on our first married Christmas, and I will never forget it.
Yeah, awesome. Awesome story. Yeah, mine was purchased used, and so mine was I think it was a 96. It was a VR when they still had the R for Rosewood on the stamp.
Same here, yeah.
Oh, yours is a VR. I thought it might have been. Yeah, I thought it was. And mine is now owned by a very dear friend in England. Again, when I had to give up V-necks, just about the same time I was giving up the long scale, I had to move that on.
Let's pause for a moment and listen to a Martin OM. This is the Martin OM28.
So the OM is rich in lore and history, and I'm going to go back and try to get through this fairly quickly. Martin guitars from 1833 into the 20th century were 12-fret guitars and looked a lot more like what you'd consider classical guitars. And, of course, were primarily gut string. They didn't get into steel strings until the early 1900s when the Hawaiian music craze came out and they started making steel string guitars for people who played with a slide, and typically as a lap steel sort of playing. And that led them to then start bracing guitars a little heavier so they could be used with gut string or steel string. And by the mid-20s, they were well into everybody's going steel string, so we're going steel string too. A lot of people were under the impression, and were given the impression, that the first OM came about when a famous banjo player named Perry Bechtel, who had a jazz orchestra out of Atlanta, Georgia, came to Martin and said now that guitars were coming out with steel strings and jazz was moving more and more into the guitars, And Gibson had sent him an L5, but he didn't like the sound of it. And he went to Martin and said, "Could you take your largest model and make me a longer neck guitar?" And that's how the OM came about. Modern scholarship has actually shown that's not true. Once people went into the archives and really went in through the archives and started seeing the correspondence, and they learned that, if I remember correctly, it was a fellow named Al Esposito. He had a name similar to Esposito, if it wasn't Esposito exactly. And he worked for the Carl Fischer music company in New York City. And he wanted Martin to make a 14-fret tenor guitar to appeal to tenor banjo players. And so in 1929, maybe 28, they made the Carl Fischer special. And the Carl Fischer special.
That's easy for you to say.
Exactly. Doesn't look like other Martins. It's kind of got a roundish bottom bout and a smaller, taller. Well, maybe it's not smaller, but it's a taller upper bout, but it's not shaped at all like a typical Martin. And it's got an extra long 14-fret neck. They had some issues with it, and so it wasn't ordered again. And Martin took that, and in 1930, they came out with their, I think they called it an let me see if I remember this. They called it an O28T, I think. It was no, I'm sorry, it was not. It was an 018. It was an 018T for tenor. And so they basically reshaped it, made it a shorter neck. And around that same time that they were working on this, Perry Bechtel was I'd come up to Pennsylvania to go on a fishing trip with Frank Henry Martin. And so Bechtel, who was working for the Cable Piano Company in Atlanta, in addition to being a band leader, he worked for this musical instruments company. He came up to go fishing with Frank Martin. And while he was at the factory, he saw them working on a Carl Fischer model. And he said, "Could you make me a 6-string guitar like that?" And he originally wanted 17 frets, I think he asked for. And they ultimately came back to him and said, that doesn't work. We'll do a 14 fret. And so they made Perry Bechtel, but it's essentially the first OM28. It was, I think, called a 00028 Special. And we all thought for many, many years that it was the first OM28. Scholarship, not as recent as the whole Carl Fischer thing, had shown people through the correspondence that was discovered in the archives, again, between Perry Bechtel and Frank Martin, that his guitar actually had its slotted headstock and was shaped in like not an arrowhead or maybe like a snake head shape to it. And some other things that were different about it. And we don't know that much about the guitar because it was destroyed in a fire. He didn't own it very long before it was destroyed. So we have no idea what the first OM, the Perry Bechtel 00028 Special, really looked like. But it immediately made Frank Martin say, we should sell these. And so in very late 1929, they started making the OM28. And the 1929/1930 OM28 was the first 14-fret guitar sold by Martin under their own name. And it is considered the watermark. It is where, and the place where modern acoustic guitar really took off, because everybody started making 14-fret guitars. People experimented with 13-fret guitars and 15-fret guitars, all that. Martin's OM basically revolutionized the guitar world. They were built very lightly. They were called orchestra models to appeal to jazz orchestra leaders. And at Martin, and the OM didn't just mean that body size. It meant any guitar that had a 14-fret neck. So when you see the Dreadnoughts came out in 14 frets in 1934, when they converted their entire line to 14 frets, they're actually advertised as orchestra model size D. So this is what I meant when I said OM and orchestra model can mean different things to different people. So basically, at Martin, up until this century, OM meant a 14-fret guitar, even though they only called the models they sold OMs that were the auditorium size with the long scale neck, quarter-inch bracing, and a 1 3/4 inch width nut. The OM evolved very rapidly because they were very lightly built. They were basically, what they really did is they took their 12-fret triple O size, which was the largest model they offered under their own brand at that time, and they squashed the shoulders down to kind of flatten them out to expose 2 more frets. They also had to move the brace, the bridge placement as a result, and that's where they came up with the first OM shape that was used for Mr. Bechtel, and then also the original OMs. They then strengthened the bracing a little bit, and so the original OMs had a 5/16 inch cross brace, X brace, and 1/4 inch tone bars. They did not do that again on OMs until the Authentic series, because modern guitars are built a little heavier and finished a little heavier. And so when they brought the OM back years later, they used all 1/4 inch bracing. But in the original OMs, people know, had a pyramid bridge, like a straight bridge with the pyramids on the side. They quickly went to a belly bridge for their steel string guitars when they realized they needed that extra tension. Though, of course, many people have straight bridges and pyramid bridges out there and don't have any problems with them at all. Martin felt for warranty reasons, they felt the need to use the modern belly bridge, which is, deeper and has more wood behind the pins. The old OMs have a smaller maple bridge plate. And then when they decided they were going to convert their entire lineup to 14-fret guitars, starting in 1934, they retired the OM stamp. So they came out with the OM28, the OM18, and the OM45, and then in 1930 only, they had the brief run of the OM45 Deluxe. There's still some debate about how many were actually made, and they believe there were 12 in all, possibly 11. Some people think there may have been 12. And I think when they discovered that Roy Rogers' OM45 Deluxe wasn't actually listed with the other ones, they've decided there were 12. I think that's how it went. And his was unique. His had a different pickguard inlay pattern than the other ones. And they also made 2 OM42s as a special order for some dealer. And Style 42 back in those days had a much shorter fingerboard marker pattern. It had that big round snowflake at the 5th fret, and there was no markers above the 5th fret. So it looks different than Style 42 we know today. And then, so in 1934, they changed the stamp. So, and by that time, you only had the OM28 and the OM18 turning into a triple O28 and a triple O18, and the OM45 became the triple O45. I don't remember if they were making the 45s in early 1934, but for those out there who don't know this, a 1933 OM28 or OM18 that was built, completed in, let's say, December 1933, and a triple O28 or triple O18 from January 1934 are the exact same model. They still had the long scale neck. They still had the same bracing, and everything was identical. And then we don't know how far into, or I don't know how far into 1934, they decided to take the OM long scale and bring it back down to the short scale so that the triple O's and the double O's and the O's all had the same short scale. So early 1934 triple O's are in fact exactly the same as late 1930 OMs. So the OMs went away. And then they got rediscovered by certain musicians, people like Eric Schoenberg in the 1960s, when people were getting into ragtime guitar and fingerstyle guitar. People started rediscovering the old OMs. And in 1969, Eric Schoenberg went to Fred Martin and convinced him to make a short run of OM28s for the first time since 1933. And ironically, I was quite shocked that Eric claims that it didn't even occur to him that it was the anniversary of the 1929 introduction of the OM. So I always thought he purposely did it because it's the 60th anniversary of the OM, and it turns out it had never occurred to him. So there was a brief run of OM 28s in 1969, and I bet you they are uber collectible. I would love to see one. And these would have been Brazilian rosewood and a big V-neck and wide string spacing and all that. And then the OM started showing up a little bit here and there in the 1980s. They made a limited edition that was basically the same thing as an OM28V, may have been slightly different in very little respects. That same year, they made a special model for the Sing Out magazine. I think 35th edition anniversary of Sing Out magazine was also a vintage style OM28, the OM28 SO with a label signed by Pete Seeger. And he wasn't an OM player, but he's involved with Sing Out magazine. And then they came out with a couple, what they called the Guitars of the Month. Some people may remember Guitars of the Month. They didn't really, I don't think, make one every month, but that's what they called them. They actually did an HOM35 with a three-piece back, and they did some other kind of Guitar of the Month. Oh, it was an OMC 28. So this is all before or in around the beginning of the vintage series when they started making the OM28. The OMs didn't enter the catalog until 1990, if I remember correctly. And they came out with the OM28, which had a black pickguard and big white domino dots and a white binding, just like the D28 of that time period, and an OM45 that has hexagon markers and looks like the D45 from that era. These have 1 3/4 inch width nut, 2 1/4 inches at the 12th fret, 2 1/4 inch string spacing, which is a little narrower than vintage OM string spacing, and a low profile neck. They then decided shortly after that to retire both of those and replace them with less expensive OMs, and those being, anybody remember, the OM42, which has the fancy cat's eyes and snowflake fingerboard markers, and the OM21. The OM21 at that time has Indian fretboard and bridge and microdot, little microdot, what they called style 16, I think is what they called those little tiny dots on the fretboard. And big seller, sold very well for a very long time. Style 20, that's when style 21 reappeared. And this time it didn't have, it had black binding and later tortoise binding. And I think maybe the original OM21s all had tortoise binding, but rosewood fingerboard and bridge, and no purfling around the edge of the top or the back. Very plain in terms of trim, but really interesting woods usually, and big seller. So the OM21 OM42 basically has been in production ever since, and they both got the big revamp in 2018 with the reimagined series. The vintage series we mentioned, those are great OMs. Lawrence Juber's fantastic signature models, Adirondack spruce with cutaways. Those are based on the OM28V with the V-neck, and but it has 2 1/4 inch string spacing. Marvelous guitars. They made them in rosewood. They made them with mahogany. They made them in koa. They made them in maple. And there were, I think, some dealer runs out there in other woods too. And let's see, the other signature model I think of is the Richie Sambora was an OMC41. That's a very cool looking guitar.
Oh, yeah.
And it has a companion 12 string that's an M. So that's a pretty cool match set for somebody who likes Pearly Martins. So during all this time, the Triple O was still there. And the Triple O was down to the Triple O18 and the Triple O28. Occasionally the Triple O45. These guitars by 1946 became non-scallop braced, 5/16 inch bracing. We don't know exactly when they lost the 1/4 inch tone bars. We don't know if it was right when they changed the scale or if it was a little bit later. But Triple O's from the late 40s onward were non-scalloped, 5/16 inch bracing, short scale neck with a 1 11/16 inch nut. And all the way up into the time that Maury and I started playing Martin guitars, the Triple O18 and the Triple O28 were the last remaining standard Triple O's. Same thing, short scale, dots on the fretboard, black binding or white binding, black pickguard or a black pickguard on both of them. And so they were quite different from the OMs. And it was only in the 21st century did those two triple O's get revamped and get vintage styling and get scallop bracing. And for whatever reason, the triple O 28 has 5/16 inch scallop bracing. The triple O 18 has 1/4 inch scallop bracing, which I always called OM bracing. But they're short scale, and so they do not sound the same. They sound similar to if we took 100 customers and we sat them down with a triple O 28 and an OM 28 today, a bunch of them would say, I don't hear much difference. But I think plenty of people will. I certainly do. I think the OM gives you a little more bass presence. I think gives you a little more. I think volume is perceived differently. I think the fact that the heavier bracing in the short scale, to me, gives a much more of like a column of sound coming forward, where the OM has more of an expansive out and around and a more pronounced undertone. And I think I hear the harmonic resonance more and more ethereally, the way those harmonics hover in the air. And I think also the OM gives you a bigger kick when you're playing hard, when you are basically using it like the way you use a dreadnought. Again, if you ever see Maury performing in concert with his OM 28 VER, you'll understand exactly what I mean about being able to really put out sound and really dig into them and mine a lot of power out of them. And I think the triple O's are very good. My guitars are short scale now, and I except for one, and that's for practical reasons with my hands and fingering and all that stuff and stuff I do on the fretboard. So, but I still love the sound of an OM. So that was a quick, hopefully not too long ramble from where the OM started and where it's ended up, and how the triple O actually separated from the OMs. When the OMs were brought back, they were quite different kinds of guitars, and in the 21st century have become much more similar in terms of neck, and at least in the case of the 28s and 42s, they have bracing.
I think I got it, but just in case, tell me the whole thing again. I wasn't listening.
So I'm curious to hear other people's read other people's comments about all this. And I'll just mention that one guitar that I have that's long scale is a triple O C16 from 1995, I think. And those guitars were the closest thing to an OM18 that Martin had ever put out since 1933, because it was short. They have 1/4 inch scallop bracing at a time when the triple O 18 had 5/16 non-scallop, and it has a long scale neck. They decided not to call it an OM because it doesn't have the wider OM neck. It's got this, and it's actually got a 22 fret neck, because Martin's original cutaway, Martin's original cutaway is the one with the oval sound hole that you guys will see at times online. And they needed to do that because they wanted to give it the 22 fret neck of an electric guitar. And so it's a deeper cutaway with they had to squash the sound hole into an oval shape to make room for those extra frets. And I sort of wish they still did that, but because it's a pretty cool design. So everybody, it's time for you to write Martin and say, bring back the OM18 and the OMC18. Let's hear it.
Not only that, you have to write Maury's music too. I got to tell you, listening to that whole story, you have literally motivated me to make an announcement on this podcast. I haven't thought about this prior. It's just something I'm going to spit out. We are going to bring back the OM18 at Maury's Music. I'm going to make a custom order with Andrew later today. We're going to bring that guitar back to market. Even if it's only in our little store, it should not be put aside like it has been. And all this talk about all these 28s, 42s, 21s, coming from a Rosewood lover myself, I still have to admit it. There is a place for the OM18, and we're going to do it.
Woo! Woo! 3 cheers! 3 cheers for Maury. Hip, hip, hooray!
You better buy them.
That's super cool. That's super cool. So yes, we'll discuss So here's my trivia question. One of the signature models I forgot to mention, which I believe is considered the very first signature model, was the OM28 Perry Bechtel. And I think officially it was called OM28 Perry Bechtel 1933 because they didn't want to have to deal with banjo tuners, which I forgot to mention is what were on the original orchestra models because they were trying to appeal to banjo players, which, by the way, didn't really work very well. Not many banjoists bought the OMs. The people who did buy the OMs were the radio stars like Roy Rogers and Gene Autry. They bought the OMs, and because they found they worked very well when playing in front of a microphone in front of an orchestra on the radio. But anyway, Perry Bechtel's OM signature model is very similar to the OM28V. In fact, it came out 3 years after the first OM28VR. But I think the only difference is it has wider string spacing, and maybe the shape of the V-neck is different. But my trivia question is, can you name a famous American musician who was in a songwriting team that dominated progressive popular music in the 1970s, who owned an OM28 Perry Bechtel? And a second hint, Maury's band, the Shell Shock Churchills, and his other part-time band, Dork with the silent F, plays multiple songs by that songwriting duo.
Wow, so I should know it, but I don't.
Well, I think you'll be very surprised to learn that it's Walter Becker of Steely Dan.
No way, really?
Way. Garth, way. Yes, supposedly I saw, somebody bought it and when was proclaiming it, on the internet that he owns Walter Becker's OM28 Perry Bechtel. So I think that's pretty cool. I never knew that certainly when he was alive because and back in the 70s, I didn't know that much about acoustic guitars yet. I wouldn't have known a Perry Bechtel from a George Jones, but but I thought that was pretty cool. So
that's wild.
I know Steely Dan has meant a lot to you over the years in your listening and playing pleasure. So now you're happy to know that you had similar taste to good old Walter. So
we have so much in common, he and I.
Well, I have to say, you guys do a bang-up job with your Steely Dan stuff. I've always been very impressed at your ability to play that stuff. Always very impressive. So check out the Shell Shock Churchills and the Dork Fest videos on YouTube. See what I'm talking about.
Well, thanks very much, Spoon, for saying that. We do have a lot of fun. We're taping this show ahead of time, but if you're in the future and you have Marty McFly's DeLorean, you want to go back in time to March 11th, we're going to be at the Jim Thorpe Broadway Grill. But of course, that's impossible. But you missed a good show. Let me say it that way.
So here's the answer to the first trivia question. What is the Martin OM model that's a signature model that's still available for sale today? The OM-JM John Mayer. So the OM-JM was inspired by the OM28V, but it had a low-profile neck, and it has an Engelmann top. And the original signature model also had some inlays and stuff that were unique to that limited edition. The for sale version in the catalog isn't as fancy, but it has the Engelmann top, and it has the low-profile neck. And does it have a 1 11/16 inch low-profile neck?
It does, yes.
Yeah, okay, that's what I thought.
So I do have a couple of pieces of housekeeping I should get to before I forget to wrap the show up. We were talking about all the OM guitars you could buy from Martin, all the guitars that are in current production that you can find anywhere. There are some guitars you can only find at Maury's Music. We bring in things like custom shop OM28s with Adirondack top, OM28 with an Engelmann top, OM28 with an Engelmann top and a pickup that kind of pushes the things towards the OM28 John Mayer that you remember. And there's always that very famous guitar that only a couple of people can ever aspire to have. It's the OM28V Maury Rutch replica. We actually took the time to go and spec out a VTS topped OM28 with a V-neck that kind of recreates my guitar minus the boogering up the sound hole that you have to do yourself. But we do strive to bring a lot of guitars to market that Martin won't really make anymore, and that's just a short list of what they are. And the one thing I wanted to ask you, Spoon, many customers that call us and ask us, what's the difference in feel between a triple O and an OM? I often suggest this next thing because I have heard it said on forums and all over the internet. If you take a regularly tuned to concert pitch OM and you detune it a whole step, so instead of your bass note being E, your bass note's going to be a D. If you do that and then you put a capo on the second fret, it's not going to change the scale length, so you don't get to feel the difference with frets being closer together, but kind of you get a feel for what an OM sounds like versus a triple O. A detuned OM with a capo on the second fret is kind of like what a triple O sounds like being tuned to concert pitch without a capo. What are your thoughts on that, Spoon? Is there any merit to that?
I would say, except that you used the word sound, we originally started talking about feel. That gives you some indication of what the string tension is like. And that's one of the pluses of the triple O, is that if you're using the same gauge strings, the triple O, it's easier to bend, and you can actually get a full, almost electric guitar, full bend out, if you're strong enough, out of a triple O that you're not going to get out of an OM. Obviously, for people like Lawrence Juber, and whose hands are like little gymnasts, that he doesn't even think about that. So, and he actually, uses strings that have a medium for the unwound strings, and the big bass string at the top, and then triple O, light gauge strings in the middle of them there. But so it's really up to the person. Feel wise, for me, again, you mentioned that you're not getting the scale difference, and that's a big difference. Particularly when you start to go up the neck, the frets are just a tiny bit closer together, so the stretch is not as extreme. And for people who have short thumbs like me, or otherwise have, in my case, old injuries, things like that are bothering me these days, that's a big difference for me. I like the OM power more, but I like the string, the spacing of the frets and the bendability of the strings better on a triple O. That being said, I use cutaways. When you get up by the 12th fret or above the 12th fret, the frets are a little too close together on the triple O compared to the OM. So you get some traffic jams up there. I can still do it. I still play up there all the time. But it's a really close call in terms of trying to finger more than one string, and doing things on top of your fingers on top of each other, and a triple O, where the OM just gives you a tiny bit more. You would hardly notice it until you really run into those traffic jams, that an OM is a little easier to play up the neck because the frets are farther apart. Where farther down the neck, the triple O's easier to play because the frets are closer together. So it is a bit of a trade-off. But I think that's an interesting question, because I have actually done that myself in the past, and tried that out. And I'd say it does give you an idea of what it's like to play the short scale guitar, and the slacking of the strings probably helps it sound a little bit more like a triple O. But I still think you're probably, because of the bracing difference, if you're talking about the triple O 18, maybe because that has the same brace size as an OM, the triple O 28, triple O 42 have thicker bracing. So I don't think you're getting an exact sound comparison. But I think it's an interesting experiment for people to try who don't have the opportunity to go play a triple O if they have an OM.
All right, guys, so I'm going to make you a deal. We're getting near the end of the program here. I'm going to give you some extra credit, but you got to do us a solid. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what you can do if you're looking for an OM guitar from Martin. And if you found value in this podcast, please consider sharing it with just one person, even if it means you have to pull them aside, take their phone out of their hand, and help them find out how to get to Apple Podcasts. Please help us spread the word. It's your job after this show to go and find just one person. And that's all we could ever ask for. If you're looking for an OM guitar from Martin and all the models we talked about still aren't enough, you can also look at the 0015M, the 0015M Streetmaster, and the 0010E. As Spoon would agree, these are all guitars that have the OM size, the OM scale length, and the 1 3/4 inch nut.
Very good point. So this goes back to the fact that in the 1990s, Martin started making some triple O's in style 16 and eventually style 15 that have the long scale neck, because that had become the industry standard, and they wanted to compete directly with other makers of relatively inexpensive guitars in that body size. And so the 15s have stayed true to the long scale, at least for now. It's very likely Martin's going to change the 0015 to short scale at some point, just to have everything be the same with a 00 on a stamp. But very good point. I'm glad you pointed that out as we wrap up today's program on the Martin OM models. So don't forget, don't be confused. Orchestra model used to mean any Martin with a 14 fret neck and that corresponding body shape in any size, but they only ever sold guitars with OM and the model stamp that were in the auditorium size that is shared by the OM and the 00.
Yes, and please take a moment to let us know in the comments section of the YouTube version of this video, what is your favorite Martin OM? From all of us at Maury's Music, thanks for listening.
Hear you later.
This has been a presentation of Maury's Music, your trusted source for Martin and Blue Ridge guitars. Find us online at maurysmusic.com.